Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Sirui Autofocusing 1.33x Anamorphic 20mm f1.8. Now, Sirui's most recent autofocus 40mm anamorphic lens we've discovered was not a one-off. It's one of the questions that I asked as part of my review of that lens, wondering whether this was a one-time, adventure by Sirui to test the market, or if this was the beginning of a series. It turns out it is the beginning of a series. And so lens number 2 comes in the form of a very similar, yet obviously much wider 20mm T1.8 Cine lens. Of course, what makes this series unique is that these are not just autofocusing lenses, but rather these are true Cine lenses that happen to have autofocus. That, of course, has been done a few times, most notably kind of in this space. I would say that Samyang's VAF lenses are somewhat similar. What makes these unique is that they are natively 1.33 times anamorphic lenses. Of course, cameras are increasingly hybrid devices that are just as capable for video work as they are for stills. And so this is a lens that can take advantage of that, particularly for those who are looking for a little bit more cinematic footage. And of course, that letterbox, wide letterbox type look is certainly a way that does look more cinematic. Most of the time when people are serious about getting cinematic footage, you'll see they've got quite a big array going on. They've got monitors and they've got grips and they've got all kinds of things that are going on. However, I have found that with these lenses, it is perfectly easy to go out and get really decent looking footage with just a camera and a lens. And I think that that's going to appeal to a lot of people who would like to get that cinematic type footage, but aren't really all that invested in going into all the paraphernalia that comes a part of being an actual filmmaker. So is this a lens worth buying? An extension to the series of what we've already seen? Well, that's what we're here to explore in today's review. Like the 40mm, this is technically an S35 or APS-C lens. But like the 40mm, it does seem to actually cover the full frame image circle on my Sony bodies reasonably well. Now, obviously, if you're getting like the Fuji X-mount version, you're on an APS-C platform, it really doesn't matter to you. But in these cases where you are using these platforms where both S35 and full frame are available to you, there is an option here. Now, I will say that this isn't quite as seamless in covering the full frame image circle, and I'll demonstrate that to you here. You can see from this shot that, number one, while there is heavy vignette in the corners, there is no of the hard mechanical vignette where you see where actually part of the frame is obscured. So what we see is heavy vignette, but it is just normal vignette, not irredeemable vignette that cannot be corrected. So you can actually, although in Lightroom I maxed out to 100% slider, and there's still a little bit left in a high contrast, snowy type scene as I've used here. However, it is largely corrected. Likewise, you can see here that it's not that there's great image quality out past that S35 kind of mark towards the edges of the frame, but there still is some image quality. So it's not like it's not resolving that at all. So I'll look at that kind of in two different ways. If you're looking at it from the perspective of, from stills type perspective, I wouldn't be satisfied with that for stills work, and those corners are too weak for me. But it's a whole different story when you're talking about video. In fact, kind of one of the anamorphic qualities that is quite common in anamorphic lenses is that they intentionally are not super sharp in the corners and kind of leave this a little bit softer, more unresolved corner of the frame to kind of focus the eye, not only through vignette, but also through focus itself. And I see it quite commonly in all kinds of cinematic footage. And so if you view it in that way, I think that there's shots, this one for example, where I think that shooting without any kind of correction, that it works just fine. And so, it's great that we at least have that option. You got two different framing options. One in this case I think is more compromised than what it was with the 40mm that I felt like I could use pretty much seamlessly with just maybe a little bit slightly heavier vignette. In this case there's more to it than that, and we'll see a little bit more of that as we go along in this review. But I think for certain shots you certainly can get away with it. Now if you're shooting in the S35 crop, that's a 1.5 times crop factor on these various platforms that the lens will be available for, and that is a full frame equivalent of 30mm, and so wide, not super wide, but wide enough certainly to be useful. Here, this is an anamorphic lens, so it has the anamorphic squeeze. So the footage coming right out of the camera is going to look like this, and so it's not going to be in the right perspective. It's designed to where it needs to be de-squeezed, and so right now the actual squeeze is a constant 1.33 times. So that will give you a 2.35 to 1 ratio when shooting in 16:9. So that gives you some of that, the black bars at the top and the bottom of the frame, and that wider cinematic look after de-squeezing. Now you'll see here on my camera, I actually have an Atomos Ninja here, and this is not just a monitor, but this allows me to, actually record, and I use it a lot as a part of my review process. One of the unique things about not only using a monitor like this, I like this kind of monitor because you can also record the footage right to it, or you can record what your camera is seeing, things like that. But in this case, this, along with other cheaper monitors, will allow you to actually view the de-squeeze, and so you can actually apply that de-squeezing to it, and so you can see in the monitor. You can't see that on your camera. The camera doesn't naturally do the de-squeezing, at least any of the cameras that I have tested this kind of lens on. But if you're using that monitor, you can see what the actual final footage is going to look like, and that obviously can be very, very useful. The T-stop of this lens is T1.8, and so that typically would correspond to an f-stop of f1.8. The fact, however, that we're getting an actual T-stop, which measures light transmission, of being at 1.8 shows that this is a nice bright lens. It's not been unusual in times past for some lenses, for example, that are marketed for photography that have a maximum aperture of f1.4 to have an actual T-stop rating of f1.6, even f1.7. So the fact that this is nice and bright means that it's going to be useful, allow you to keep your speed up in lower light situations. So as noted, this comes in a variety of mounts. So that includes Sony E-mount, which is tested here. I've mentioned Fuji X. Also Nikon Z is available, and even a micro 4/3. So obviously the crop factor is going to be 2 times there, and so 20 millimeters is going to behave more like 40 millimeters full frame equivalent. As has been the case with this series, both the aperture ring and then also the focus rings, they are geared with the standard teeth settings, and so you can throw gearing on there if you're so desiring. The actual focus throw here is 360 degrees, though I will note that this manual focus isn't as good. Remember, this has to be focused by wire because we now have an autofocus motor. It means there's no hard stops here, so you don't have that to work from. And it also just means that the feel is a little more vague and not as good as a true manual focus lens. However, I do appreciate the fact that it remains linear and we have a full 360 degree throw, which allows you to have some precision in that. And again, that's more of a standardized setting for that. MSRP has not been announced yet for this lens. However, the 40 millimeter MSRP was $799, but it's pretty often the case with Sirui products. They start at a discounted price, and frankly, they often remain at that discounted price. So I wouldn't be surprised to see the price actually settle out to being $700, even $650 or slightly more moving ahead. 2 different variations are sold of the lens. There is a blue streak flare edition, and then there is a natural warm streak edition. That's what I have tested here. I tested the blue streak on the 40 millimeter. I see a lot of design language that is familiar to me from the recent Sirui Aurora 85mm f1.4 stills lens, some of the same fonts, and then also basically the same feature set here. And so that includes the ability to both click and declip the aperture, which is very useful, an AF/MF switch on the side, a focus lock or custom button here on the side function button. You can program to a variety of different features there, and then also some weather sealing is part of the design. All of those things are very, very welcome because it becomes part of the feature set that people that are shooting in this space, might come to expect on other lenses. So the fact that we've got all of that, and then also we have got an anamorphic lens, is pretty great. Now, consistency is somewhat important in these lenses, and so what we will find is that as far as the diameter here is 80 millimeters or 3.1 inches. That allows you to have the standardized kind of front width for putting on a standard matte box there. The length here is considerably shorter, however, than the 40 millimeter lens. You can see here from the side, it is only 90 millimeters in length, or 3.54 inches. That's 30 millimeters shorter than the other lens, and as a byproduct, it is considerably lighter. It's only 499 grams or 17.6 ounces. That is a weight savings of 101 grams. So obviously significant. I will note that this is really compact for an anamorphic lens. Anamorphic lenses tend to be much larger than this, and frankly, I've tested one from Sirui before. I believe it was the Saturn 35mm, and I think it was a T2.9, if I'm not mistaken. And that lens was a little narrower than this, but it was considerably longer. And so this is a beautifully compact lens, particularly for having such a wide focal length. So that's great. And so the aperture works well, does everything that we would want. Inside we have 11 blades, and of course in this case it is a traditional oval shape that is part of the look of anamorphic. The 40mm had a little bit of a weird bokeh signature of specular highlights when it was wide open. This is a little bit more traditional, and frankly, it is better for it. On the lens mount itself, we do have a USB-C port that will allow for firmware updates. Very important on a lens with autofocus like this. Minimum focus distance is 40 centimeters. Now, unfortunately, that results in still very low level of magnification. So just know that you're not going to, there's probably going to be moments where you would like to get a little bit closer to your subject than what you're going to be able to do. Just not necessarily a strength for either one of these lenses to this point. It does come with a nice nylon zippered case, kind of a premium type packaging. And the lens itself, quality feels nice. It's, you know, it's lightweight, but the build quality feels very good. This feels like a nice lens, and particularly if you're getting it near that $650 price range to $700, I mean, that's a tremendous value for a lens like this. So this is an autofocus lens, and much like the 40mm, it is equipped with an STM or a stepping focus motor. And like the 40mm, this is a really good application of STM. In fact, in this case, I actually found that autofocus speed is better. Maybe being that wider focal length just kind of works to its advantage, but it's able to snap back, as you can see, if not instantaneously, with a good amount of quickness. I had no issues with that. It's very quiet in operation, and so again, no issues on that regard. I found that eye tracking worked very well. You can see on this shot as I kind of pan in towards Nala and then kind of move around, and then as she begins to stretch and begins to move around, you can see that throughout the shot, all of that is autofocus taking place. No manual focus going on there, and it's doing a very good job of just keeping focus where it should be, locked where it should, and giving me the outcome that I want. And so really great in that regard. I did find also that like focus pulls, they look great here. Focus pulls have, they're nice and smooth. They have a nice cinematic feel to it, which is, I can't tell you how important I find that. If it's going to be autofocus, it needs to be tuned for cine still, and I think that that is the case. It's quite an organic looking focus pull, so I like that. There's no visible steps. There's no kind of hunting or pulsing. Likewise, I found with my hand test that there's a good transition from my hand to my eye and back and forth. And you will note throughout both of these tests that focus breathing is quite low. It's nicely damped, and so the byproduct is that there's nothing that's kind of jarring that pulls you out of the shot when focus changes. You can also see in this shot, for example, that if I go from starting with autofocus on a close subject and then I kind of pan across to where it's going to pull focus to a distant subject, you can see that that pull itself is also really nicely damped, and it feels very cinematic. It just, you go from the foreground focus point to the background focus point without anything jarring. That's great. And so autofocus is doing what it should in this regard, and so I appreciate that very much. So talking about image quality here, and obviously my coverage of this is a little bit different with a cine lens. It's less about charts. It's more about what I'm observing and actually shooting footage. But I will try to demonstrate some of those attributes. We've already talked a little bit about the full frame coverage, and here once again you can see the difference between shooting full frame and then S35, and again, you know, it does technically cover the full frame, but it does that with some flaws. And so one of those other flaws that is going to be here, the 40mm was largely distortion free. That's not the case here. There certainly is some distortion issues, and those become much more pronounced when when you're actually shooting in the full frame. And so, for example, in this shot, you can see that if you look at the edges of the frame, there's much more curvature that gets there. And when we switch to S35, just some of that is cut off. And so that is just one of the areas where you can see, you're going to see less of it if you are shooting in S35. Now, when it comes to that distortion can be corrected in video footage, and I was able to do that, fairly cleanly. However, I will also point out that it's in many cases, software, if you're getting like a free or a kind of a budget version of various photo or video editing software, you're going to find that distortion correction is not part of that package, and it tends to be in some of the the premium versions. So, for example, one of the most popular kind of free versions, people will use DaVinci Resolve. Well, if you want to do distortion correction, that module is only available in the premium version that you actually have to pay for. So just note that one of the downsides of shooting with a Cine lens that has distortion is that it does require you to have typically the kind of editing software that will correct for that. So again, your mileage may vary on all of that. One of the other things that is exaggerated in the full frame portion of the frame, but is a problem in general, is lateral style chromatic aberrations. They are very pronounced in that area that's cut off, as you can see here, but they also do exist in the S35. Not as bad, but I do see some of that. And so if you're in a situation where it's going to be really obvious if there are lateral style chromatic aberrations, definitely shoot an S35 because, again, all of these things are a little easier to fix with stills than what they are with video. And so I would just shoot trying to avoid that. Now, as noted, I am shooting with the natural streak version, as you can see here. So that's, anamorphic. That's part of the look, is to get that wide kind of streak that goes there. You can also get the blue streak, as noted. The flare itself is better than what the 40mm was. And so I will say this for it, that I actually found that in most situations, flare resistance was fairly good. It's not perfect. There still are some ghosting artifacts. But overall, I felt like flare resistance was fairly good, other than, that intentional flare that's part of the kind of optical look that is a part of that. When it comes to color, I would say that I don't find Sirui optical glass to be my absolute favorite. It's not top class to me, but I will say that footage looks good. And, one thing I will say about that too is that I don't find that the lens is maybe as naturally sharp as what the 40mm was. I didn't really feel like I needed to add a lot of sharpening to the 40mm. I feel the need more for it here, but as you can see here, it actually holds up to sharpening pretty well. And I felt like I could dial up quite a bit of sharpening without things falling apart. And to me, I preferred the crisper, higher contrast look there. I also prefer the fact that the bokeh quality is a little bit more traditionally oval here, as opposed to kind of that weird shape that it was on the 40mm. So while there's not going to be a lot of situations where you produce a lot of bokeh, well, what is there I do actually prefer here. So my conclusion is this autofocusing 1.33x Anamorphic 20mm T1.8, it has a few more optical flaws than what the 40mm did, but it's also, I think, a far more useful focal length in many situations. And, the great thing about what you're seeing right now is that I was able to get all of this footage with nothing more than just a camera and the lens. I was able to trudge through deep snow and just shoot handheld footage and put together something that, is at least credible. That's the value of this lens, I think, providing an affordable, functional, and compact anamorphic lens. It's doing, again, something that now has been done by Sirui, but I think making it even more useful by giving us this wider focal length to work with. So at the end of the day, I think that this is a pretty cool lens, and one that I certainly would enjoy using for just more creative content in the future. I'll pass it on to my team, and Craig in particular is more focused on the video side of things, but we'll use it as a part of our team for producing footage, both for the channel, for the church, for other things like that. Just a very useful tool, and I suspect that a lot of filmmakers, aspiring filmmakers, will find it to be just that. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description below. There are buying links there. It's just coming to market, so those links are just being populated, but check those out, and I suspect there will be a promotion code there as well, depending on what Sirui says to me as we get close to the launch. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.